Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. The day had been sweltering, the kind of heat that seemed to cling to your skin, suffocating everything it touched. Jason Klein, a long-haul trucker on his usual route, had just turned off the main highway, steering his rig onto the side road that would take him through the backwoods and towards a gas station that barely seemed to exist on most maps. His radio was nothing more than static, and the monotonous hum of the truck's engine only amplified the isolation that came with driving through the heart of nowhere. As his headlights sliced through the growing dusk, Jason's eyes caught something in the distance, a figure. It was barely more than a shadow against the overgrown road, but there was something odd about the way the figure moved. Jason slowed the truck instinctively, his hand hovering over the gearshift, unsure of what he was seeing. A hitchhiker? Maybe. But it didn't make sense. No one passed through this stretch of road unless they were in desperate need of a ride. He squinted, his heart skipping a beat as he realized that it wasn't a person at all. At least, not in the way he understood the term. The creature was small, delicate-looking, yet somehow powerful. She, or it, had skin the color of ash, smooth but luminous, almost metallic in the way it caught the light. Her hair, if it could be called that, shimmered like strands of silver and blue, flowing back as if wind-tossed, but there was no breeze to speak of. The eyes, wide and round, glowed faintly yellow, unsettling in their intensity. Jason slammed his foot on the brake, bringing the truck to a sudden halt. His pulse raced as the figure, no, the woman, stopped in her tracks. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if sensing his presence, the woman's gaze darted toward the truck. She froze, eyes widening further, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. Jason could feel her fear through the air, a palpable electric tension that hung between them. She was terrified. In a split second, she spun on her heel and bolted down the road, her feet barely making a sound on the dirt, her lithe figure disappearing into the underbrush at the side. Jason's instincts kicked in, his curiosity overpowering the caution that had kept him alive on countless roads like this one. Without thinking, he threw the truck into park and leapt out, shouting, "Hey! Wait!" The sound of his voice seemed to pull her up short for just a moment, but it was enough. She turned her head over her shoulder, eyes locking with his, a silent plea in her gaze. Then, with a sharp, fluid motion, she sprinted even faster, vanishing into the dense trees beyond. Jason hesitated. His mind screamed at him to get back in the truck, drive away. This wasn't his problem. But something deeper, a primal instinct perhaps, compelled him to follow. His boots hit the dirt with force as he began to chase after her, the underbrush thick and unwelcoming. Branches scratched at his arms, and the air felt thick with the weight of the unknown. He pushed forward, breathing heavily but keeping his eyes locked on the movement ahead. Despite the distance, he could still hear her, the rustle of leaves, the soft thud of her feet pounding the earth. She was fast. Too fast. The trees seemed to close in around him, and for a moment, Jason wasn't sure if he was still following her or if she had somehow disappeared altogether. His pulse surged as he continued forward, each step taking him deeper into a landscape that felt more alien by the second. It was then that he realized, this was no ordinary woman. There was something wrong or right depending on how you looked at it. Something not human. The thought almost stopped him in his tracks, but he pushed forward. Jason wasn't the type to back down, especially not when curiosity had taken such a firm grip on him. A part of him, perhaps the part that had seen enough strange things on the road to understand that the world held more than the eye could see, felt that he needed to find out what she was running from. And then there she was again, a flash of movement ahead of him. This time she wasn't running as much as stumbling, her breath ragged as she leaned against a massive oak tree. She hadn't noticed him yet, but he was closer now, so close that he could hear her soft murmurs, words he couldn't understand. It sounded like a prayer or a chant, her voice high-pitched and trembling. Jason paused, unsure of what to do. His presence had gone unnoticed, but he wasn't sure if that was a good thing. Was she hurt? Or was she trying to escape something far worse than him? He stepped forward cautiously, a hand reaching out to steady himself against the rough bark of a nearby tree. He opened his mouth to speak, but before a word could escape, the woman whipped her head around, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his stomach twist. Fear, but also something else. Recognition. The words she spoke then were even more incomprehensible than before, a string of syllables that didn't belong to any language Jason had ever heard. And then, with startling swiftness, she pushed off from the tree and darted again, her figure disappearing once more into the depths of the forest. Jason's heart raced as he stood there, rooted to the spot. For a moment he simply stared after her, thoughts spinning wildly in his mind. He hadn't been imagining it. She wasn't human. She was something else. He could feel it in the air around him, in the way her presence seemed to distort the very atmosphere of the woods. Something beyond his comprehension was happening, and he had no idea why she was running. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He wasn't going to let her get away that easily. Jason's feet crunched against the forest floor as he sprinted after her. The darkness had fully descended now, with only the weak glow of his truck's headlights offering any source of light. His breath was ragged, his mind swirling with confusion and the raw adrenaline of pursuit. What had he just seen? There was no way she was human. No way. Yet there she was, somewhere ahead of him, weaving through the trees just out of reach. Her speed was unnerving. Jason had been a runner in his youth, and even now in his 30s he could hold his own. But this woman, no creature, moved with the grace and fluidity of something far more than human. Her legs barely touched the ground, her form like a blur in the moonlight, leaving Jason trailing behind her. Every time he thought he was gaining ground, she seemed to vanish into the woods, as though the trees themselves swallowed her whole. Jason's muscles screamed, the air growing thick with exhaustion, but he didn't slow. He couldn't. Something deep inside him, some primal drive, pushed him forward, urging him to catch up. Then out of nowhere the woman stopped. Jason barely had time to react before she turned to face him, her figure framed by the eerie light of the moon, her silver-blue hair shimmering like some ethereal cloak. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the distance between them charged with a palpable tension. The fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by something colder, something far more dangerous. Jason froze, his heart thumping in his chest. The air felt heavy, as though the very trees around them were holding their breath, waiting. He tried to speak, to ask her what she wanted, what she was, but before he could form a word, she raised one hand, her fingers long and delicate. A pulse of energy rippled through the air. Jason felt it before he saw it, a sudden, intense pressure on his chest as if an invisible force was pushing him back. His breath hitched as his feet slid in the dirt, his body struggling against the unseen force that held him in place. What the hell? He tried to take a step forward, but the pressure only intensified. The woman's eyes were locked on him now, a strange calmness in her expression. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't fleeing. This was different. This was something else entirely. Jason's muscles tensed, his instincts screaming at him to move, but he was paralyzed. The force was too strong. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the pressure vanished. Jason staggered forward, his legs unsteady as he fought for balance. The woman, the alien woman, watched him with an expression that was almost amused. She spoke again, but the words were still incomprehensible. A soft, melodic sound that sent a shiver down Jason's spine. And then she did something unexpected. She lowered her hand and pointed to the sky, her gaze following the motion. Jason followed her eyes, his confusion deepening. There, far above the treeline, a small, bright light blinked. It was too high to be an aircraft and too steady to be a satellite. Jason squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The light flickered again, this time growing brighter, before vanishing into the vastness of the night sky. The woman turned back to him, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that seemed to burn through him. She didn't need to speak, her gaze alone was enough to tell him everything. She wasn't here by accident. Whatever she was, she had a purpose, and Jason had unwittingly become part of it. A sudden realization hit him like a freight train. She's running from something. Something worse than me. But what could possibly be worse than an alien woman with powers Jason couldn't even begin to comprehend? Before he could process this new revelation, the woman turned, her movements swift and fluid once again. She was running, no fleeing, but this time Jason didn't chase after her immediately. His mind was racing, his body still shaky from the pressure she'd placed on him. What was she trying to tell him? And why had she stopped to face him in the first place? He hesitated, trying to gather his thoughts, but it was clear. He wasn't going to get answers unless he followed her. The alien woman might have stopped momentarily, but she wasn't waiting for him to catch up. With a final deep breath, Jason resumed his pursuit. The landscape seemed to shift around him as he ran, as if the forest itself were warping, twisting into something more alien, more unnatural with every step he took. The air grew colder, the trees taller, their branches stretching in eerie, unnatural angles. Jason's mind raced with every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't some fever dream. The world around him was changing, and the woman was the catalyst. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, He broke through the trees and stumbled onto a clearing. There, in the center, was an anomaly. It was like nothing Jason had ever seen before. A large, metallic structure, more of a ship than anything else, was half buried in the earth, its surface gleaming under the moonlight. Its shape was sleek, angular, and almost organic in nature, as though it had grown out of the ground rather than being built. Vines of some strange, bioluminescent plant wrapped around it, pulsing softly as though alive. The alien woman was standing before it now, her back to him, her hands stretched outward as if calling to the craft. Her posture was serene, almost regal. She was no longer afraid, no longer desperate. She was waiting. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he approached cautiously, not knowing what to expect. The hum of the ship was faint, almost imperceptible, but Jason could feel it in his bones, deep, resonant, like the sound of something ancient stirring to life. And then, before he could speak, a voice echoed in his mind. It wasn't her voice, nor was it a sound he could hear with his ears. It was an emotion, an understanding, piercing through the very fabric of his thoughts. "You don't belong here." Jason's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a threat, but a warning clear as day. He had been drawn into something much bigger than himself. With a deep breath, he took a step forward, determined to find out why. He wasn't sure what was waiting for him, but one thing was certain. His life had just changed forever. Jason stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. The metallic craft loomed before him, a towering presence that seemed to hum with a low, rhythmic vibration. The light from the distant stars illuminated its sleek surface, revealing markings and symbols he couldn't begin to understand. The woman, her back still turned to him, seemed to sense his presence without looking. Her head tilted slightly to the side, and for the first time, Jason noticed the subtle change in the air around her. The tension had dissipated, replaced by an eerie calmness that made him feel both out of place and deeply unwelcome. "You don't belong here." The words, no, the sensation, still echoed in Jason's mind. He could feel them pressing against his thoughts, like an invisible hand pushing him away. And yet, something in him refused to retreat. His feet moved of their own accord, as though compelled by forces he didn't fully understand. He had come this far, and he was no coward. Whatever this was, he had to know. "Who are you?" Jason asked, his voice rough from the exertion of running through the forest. He spoke to the woman, but the words were meant for the craft too. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The alien woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she raised her hand again, and Jason felt a strange shift in the air, like the very atmosphere had thickened. The craft's surface shimmered briefly, and then the symbols along its hull began to glow faintly. It was almost as if the ship itself was alive, responding to her. Jason stopped just a few yards away, unsure whether he should take another step. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to flee back to his truck and pretend none of this had happened. But another part of him, the part that had always been fascinated by the unknown, the part that had spent years traveling roads few people ever dared to, pushed him forward. The woman's voice broke the silence, though her words were still foreign to him. It was a language he didn't recognize, a melody of sounds that felt like they were somehow older than human speech, deeper and more primal. She spoke again, her voice softer this time, almost a whisper. Jason's mind raced, trying to grasp at any meaning in the alien sounds. But all he could do was watch her. Her posture was fluid, graceful, like she was moving through a dance only she understood. The strange, shimmering light around her seemed to pulse in time with her movements. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the ship before them responded. The ground trembled beneath Jason's feet as the craft's engines, if that's what they were, began to hum louder. The light from the ship brightened, shifting in a rhythmic pattern, and Jason felt his chest tighten with a sudden sense of knowing. The ship was communicating with the woman, and it was listening. A deep, vibrating sound, something like a low hum, but layered with a sense of ancient power, emerged from the craft. It filled the clearing, echoing through the trees, the earth beneath Jason's feet resonating with the unnatural frequency. It was a sound that didn't belong on Earth. It felt wrong, but not in the way that would make a person run in fear. It felt wrong in a way that made him feel small, insignificant in the grand scale of the universe. The woman turned her head slightly, and Jason caught a brief glimpse of her eyes, those unsettling, glowing yellow eyes. This time they were not filled with fear, nor were they cold and calculating. They were sad. There was a deep sadness in her gaze, an understanding that Jason couldn't quite place. She spoke again, her voice a soft murmur that seemed to travel directly into his mind. "You should not have followed me." Jason felt the weight of her words, as though they carried more than just meaning. They carried a warning, an undeniable truth. She wasn't just an alien. She wasn't just a creature from another world. She was something far more complex, something caught in a struggle between forces that Jason could barely begin to understand. The craft's hum intensified, vibrating through Jason's chest now, as though it was trying to break through the boundaries of his own consciousness. The world around him began to shimmer, the edges of reality blurring like a heat wave on the horizon. His head spun, and for a brief moment he thought he might collapse. But then the woman's hand shot out, and the overwhelming sensation ceased. The world snapped back into focus, and Jason blinked rapidly to clear his vision. The ship's hum fell silent, its light dimming. The strange energy that had filled the air was gone, leaving only the quiet rustling of the forest around them. Jason's legs felt like jelly, but he remained standing, his mind racing. He had just experienced something that should have been impossible. He had felt something far beyond human understanding. And now, the alien woman was standing before him, the sadness in her eyes more evident than ever. Jason started, his voice shaking. What is this place? What are you? The woman stared at him for a long time as though measuring him. Her expression shifted, and for the first time, Jason saw something other than sadness or fear. There was acceptance. She didn't seem surprised by his questions or even by his presence. It was as if she had expected him to be here all along. Finally she spoke, her voice soft and distant, yet somehow clear. "I am one of many," she said, her words slow, deliberate, as though she were translating from something more ancient. "We are not from your world. We do not belong here. But our kind has been watching yours for a long time." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "Watching us?" He couldn't hide the disbelief in his voice. "You've been here all this time? Watching us?" She nodded slowly. Her gaze never wavered. "Your species is dangerous. You do not understand your own power. You do not understand what you are capable of." Jason felt his throat tighten, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. His mind screamed for answers, but the questions swirled in chaos. "Dangerous? What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. But the woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze to the craft again, her expression darkening. "They're coming," she said softly, almost to herself. "They know. They've always known." Jason's blood ran cold. "Who?" he asked, but his voice cracked. She turned back to him then, her eyes filled with a deep, resigned sorrow. "The ones who want to stop us." Jason's breath caught in his throat. The words the woman spoke hung in the air like a weight, pressing against his chest. "The ones who want to stop us." The phrase echoed in his mind, carrying an undercurrent of dread he couldn't quite shake off. He opened his mouth to speak, but his mind was a whirlwind, unable to find the right words. What do you mean?" Jason finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the craft, her face shadowed by the dim, flickering light from the ship. Her posture was tense, every muscle in her body taut with an unspoken urgency. She was waiting for something. Or someone. And Jason realized, with a chill creeping up his spine, that time was running out. "They're coming," she repeated, more firmly this time as if to underscore the gravity of her statement. "You're not supposed to be here, but you are. And they know that too." Jason stepped forward, instinctively wanting to reach out to her, to demand more. He had to know what was happening, why she had led him this far, why she had chosen him to follow her. "They?" Jason's voice was thick with confusion. "Who are they? What do you mean by they know?" The woman took a slow, measured breath, as though weighing her words carefully. Finally, she turned to him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him feel as though she was looking into his very soul. "They are the ones who came before us. The ones who have watched your species. From the shadows. From the stars." Her voice was laced with an ancient weariness, a hint of regret that made Jason feel small in ways he couldn't explain. "They are your creators, and your destroyers." Jason's mind reeled, struggling to grasp the enormity of what she was saying. Creators and destroyers? What did that even mean? The ones who made us? Made you? Jason couldn't keep the incredulity from his voice. "I don't understand. Who are you?" The woman's eyes softened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She seemed to be searching for the right words, words that would help him comprehend a reality far beyond anything he had known. Her gaze flickered briefly to the ship behind her, as though drawn to it, as if it held the answer she couldn't put into words. "We are not like you," she said, her voice quiet now, almost soothing. "But we are not so different either. We are descendants of the ones who came before. The ones who created your kind and many others. The ones who shaped your history without your knowledge. Jason felt his heart hammering in his chest. His breath was shallow, his thoughts tumbling over one another as he tried to process what she was saying. She couldn't be serious. But the way she spoke, calm, distant, yet laden with meaning, told him she was. She was serious. You're saying, we were made? By aliens? Jason stumbled over the words, his mind rejecting the idea, but at the same time, the sense of disbelief started to fade. The events of the night, the alien woman, the strange craft, they didn't seem so unbelievable now. Her eyes darkened, and for a moment, Jason thought she might turn away again. Instead, she took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of centuries of knowledge were bearing down on her. Yes, she said, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. We are not your creators in the way you think. We were made to be witnesses, guardians of the ones who shaped you. You were never meant to thrive in the way you have. You were always intended to fall, to become something else. Jason's head was spinning. His throat was dry, and his mouth felt as though it had turned to sandpaper. We were never meant to thrive? That didn't make any sense. Everything he knew about human history, about the rise of civilization, contradicted what she was saying. Why didn't you stop us? Jason asked, his voice tinged with desperation. He needed to understand. Why let us become what we are? The woman's expression darkened further, her lips pulling into a tight, almost imperceptible frown. She stepped closer to him, her eyes still glowing faintly in the dim light. It was not our place to interfere, she said quietly. We were not meant to intervene in the growth of your species. Your kind was meant to be a tool, a means of something greater, something more destructive. But the ones who created us, our creators, they did not anticipate what would happen. You became more than they intended. You grew beyond your purpose. Jason felt a chill crawl up his spine. Her words were like fragments of a nightmare, pieces of a dark and twisted story that had no place in reality. But the truth in her voice, the weight of her gaze, told him otherwise. We were a tool, he repeated, his voice barely audible. For what? She didn't answer immediately, as if the question itself were too painful to address. Instead, she turned back to the ship, her expression distant, haunted. They created many species like yours. They shaped worlds, altered destinies, and, ultimately, prepared for an inevitable war. She paused, glancing back at him. And now that war is coming. The ones who created you, the ones who shaped everything, they are coming to finish what they started. To correct their mistake. Jason's pulse quickened. A war? He couldn't wrap his mind around it. He was just a trucker, a regular guy with no idea of the grand scheme of things. But in that moment, standing in the presence of the alien woman, he understood. He felt it. The war she spoke of wasn't some far-off, abstract concept. It was real. And it was coming. I didn't ask for this, Jason said, his voice growing hoarse. I didn't ask to be part of this. Whatever this is. Why me? Why me, out of all the people on Earth? The woman looked at him again, her gaze softening. For a moment, it seemed as though she might offer some kind of reassurance, some explanation that would make sense of it all. But instead she said only this. You followed me. And for that, you cannot escape what is to come. Jason's chest tightened. Escape? What did that even mean? What was coming? A low rumble sounded from the ship, a vibration that seemed to echo deep in the earth, like something large and powerful stirring beneath the surface. The woman's eyes narrowed, her expression grim. They're almost here, she said, her voice filled with an urgency that sent a shiver down his spine. And when they arrive, the world you know will change. You will either stand with us, or fall with them. Jason's mind raced, and for the first time in his life, he felt the crushing weight of a reality far beyond his understanding. The universe, it seemed, had been playing a game for far longer than he had ever realized. And he was part of it. The air around them crackled with tension. Jason could feel it, a palpable pressure that squeezed the breath from his lungs. The woman, the alien, was no longer the calm, collected figure she had been earlier. Her eyes darted back to the ship, her posture rigid, as though every part of her being was on alert. The soft hum of the craft grew louder, more pronounced, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air itself. They're here, she whispered, her voice taut with urgency. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Oh, the ones who had been watching humanity from the shadows? The ones who had shaped them? The ones who had made the alien woman and the creatures like her? The weight of her words hit him like a freight train. He had thought he was just an innocent bystander in something that had no connection to him. But now he was at the center of it. and there was no escaping the storm that was coming. He turned his gaze to the sky. The stars twinkled, distant and uncaring. But something in the atmosphere had changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the wind, a flicker of light in the sky, but it was unmistakable. The air grew heavier, colder, and then there was a faint, rhythmic thrum, as if the world itself was pulsing with something beyond his comprehension. "They're coming down," the woman said again, her eyes narrowing. "The ones who created us, the ones who created you, are descending now. They found us." Jason felt a chill settle deep in his bones. This wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a prophecy, a reality that was unfolding before his eyes. He had followed the woman. He had stepped into a story he wasn't prepared for, one that had been centuries in the making. And now, the moment of reckoning was upon them. What do we do? Jason's voice trembled with the weight of the question. His mind raced, searching for any rational explanation, any logical course of action. But there was nothing. He was powerless here. He had no weapons, no knowledge of how to fight these beings, these creators who were coming to finish what they started. The woman didn't answer immediately. She stood still, her gaze fixed on the sky as though she could see something Jason couldn't, something invisible to his human eyes. The ship behind her hummed louder, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. There was an unsettling beauty to it, an almost hypnotic quality that made Jason feel as though he were being drawn into something far greater than himself. And the woman, this creature, was part of it. Part of whatever this was. "They're here," she said again, her voice stronger now, filled with a resolute certainty that sent a shiver down his spine. Jason's gaze snapped back to the sky. The stars above had begun to shift, subtle at first but unmistakable. One by one, lights appeared, streaking across the heavens like falling stars. But these weren't random. They were too deliberate, too coordinated. Jason watched, transfixed, as the lights began to draw together, converging into a single blinding mass of energy. It was as if the entire night sky had been split open, revealing something vast, ancient, and incomprehensible. He could feel the ground tremble beneath his feet, the atmosphere vibrating with an intensity that made his skin tingle. The alien woman seemed unshaken by the spectacle, her eyes focused on the lights as they grew larger, closer. "We can't stop them," she said quietly, her voice resigned. "No one can." Jason swallowed hard. The weight of her words settled into him, deeper than anything he had heard before. They were unstoppable. These beings, these creators, were far beyond anything humanity could comprehend. But still, something inside him refused to accept it. He wasn't just going to stand there and let it all happen. "What are they going to do?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's gaze flickered to him, her expression unreadable. "They've come to finish what they started. To correct the error they made when they allowed your species to grow beyond its purpose. They will either bring you under control or wipe you out." Jason's stomach twisted. "Wipe us out? Why would they do that?" he asked, his voice rising now, frustration and fear seeping through. "If they created us, why would they destroy us?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze hardening. "Because they made a mistake. Your species was never meant to evolve the way it did. They thought they could guide you, shape you into something useful. But you became wild, uncontrolled. Dangerous." Jason shook his head, trying to process the enormity of what she was saying. How could they have known all of this? "They've watched us." Jason's voice cracked with disbelief. "They've been watching us this whole time?" The woman nodded, her eyes distant. "From the beginning. They created life on many worlds, shaped civilizations, watched them rise and fall. But your species, your humanity, you became something they couldn't predict. And now you're a threat to everything they've built?" Jason's thoughts spiraled. He had always thought humanity was just human. Nothing more. Just a species that had fought its way through history to stand at the top of the food chain. But what if that wasn't the case? What if they weren't meant to be here at all? What if everything they had built, every war, every invention, every discovery, had been part of a plan they couldn't even comprehend? The woman's eyes met his again, and for the first time Jason saw something different, something that resembled pity. "I didn't want you to be caught in this. But it's too late. You're a part of it now. And whether you're ready or not, the consequences are coming." Jason swallowed hard, his chest tight with dread. But he wasn't ready to accept this fate. He wasn't going to stand idly by while the world, and everything he knew, was torn apart. There had to be something they could do. "I won't let them do this," Jason said, his voice steady now. "I'm not going to just sit here and watch my world burn." The woman's expression softened, but there was no joy in it. "You can't stop them. No one can. Jason took a deep breath, clenching his fists. He didn't know how he could fight against an enemy like this. He didn't even know what kind of power they had. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let everything he loved be wiped out without trying. No matter how hopeless it seemed. As if on cue, the lights in the sky grew brighter, almost blinding, and Jason felt the ground beneath his feet tremble harder, more violently. The alien woman's hand shot out, and she turned to him with a look of urgency. "Go," she said. "Run. They're here." Before Jason could respond, the air around them vibrated with a force he couldn't comprehend. The world around him seemed to crack open, and the alien ship behind him shifted, its lights flaring into a brilliant pulse of energy. There was no time left to argue. There was no time for anything but survival. The storm had arrived. And Jason had to decide where he stood. Jason felt the ground beneath him shake as the lights in the sky converged into an intense, almost blinding mass. The vibration in the air seemed to press down on him from all sides, suffocating in its power. His body reacted instinctively, every nerve screaming for him to run, to escape the storm that was now barreling toward him. But his feet didn't move. He stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the woman, the alien, who had dragged him into this nightmare. Her face was a mixture of resignation and fear, the kind of expression that could only come from someone who had seen too much, someone who had known for far too long that there was no escape from the inevitable. "Go," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the rising hum of the ship's engines and the crackling energy filling the air. "Run, Jason." Her words were a command, not a plea. She wasn't giving him a choice, she was ordering him to survive. But something in him refused to obey. The world around him felt as though it were closing in. He could hear the sounds of the sky itself splitting open, the ship's engines roaring to life, their power surging in waves that rattled the trees and shook the very ground beneath his feet. The alien woman was stepping back, retreating toward the ship with a strange sense of purpose, yet also an undeniable sorrow. Her eyes locked with his one final time, and Jason saw something there, something dark and powerful. It was fear. But it was also something else. Something that felt like a warning. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaky. "You've seen too much. They'll come for you too." Jason's heart pounded in his chest. Oh, he wanted to scream. "Who will come for me?" But the woman didn't answer. She turned away, stepping back toward the ship, and Jason felt the tension in the air reach a breaking point. The ground shook harder now, and the sky above began to crack open with blinding streaks of energy. There was no more time for questions, no more time to try to understand what was happening. He could run. He could turn and get in his truck, drive away from all of this and pretend it had never happened. He could find a quiet place, let the world carry on, and forget about the alien woman, the war, and the impending destruction. But as he looked at the woman, something inside him told him that running was no longer an option. That the consequences of turning his back on this moment would be far worse than whatever fate awaited him. He had come this far. And now the only thing that mattered was the choice in front of him. Could he walk away? Could he live with the knowledge of what was coming? Or was he part of something much bigger, a story that had already been written, a battle that was already being fought? Jason took a deep breath, his decision settling into his chest like a weight. He wasn't going to run. Not anymore. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice stronger than he expected. "If I'm going to die, I'm going to die here. With you?" The woman stopped in her tracks, her body stiffening. She turned slowly to face him, her eyes wide with shock. For a long moment she said nothing. Her lips parted as though she were about to say something, something to stop him, to warn him. But whatever words she had in mind died on her tongue. She seemed to be searching for something in his face, a hint of doubt, perhaps, or a weakness she could exploit to get him to change his mind. But there was none. Jason was resolute. His mind was clear now. The chaos in the air around him, the strange alien craft, the woman, all of it had led him to this moment. There was no turning back. He wasn't some bystander anymore. He was part of this. Whatever it was. "You're a fool," she said quietly, but there was no malice in her tone. It was just a statement of fact. Jason could feel the weight of her words, but he didn't flinch. He was beyond that now. He had made his choice and there was no place for fear anymore. He had to face whatever came next and he wasn't going to do it alone. Without another word, the woman moved toward the ship, her pace quickening as the energy in the air around them intensified. Jason followed, his steps heavy with determination. As they neared the craft, its surface seemed to shimmer, the lights growing brighter as if welcoming them. The ship had changed. It was no longer just a vessel. It was alive, humming with an alien energy that seemed to pulse through the very atmosphere. The woman reached the ship's entrance, a glowing door that opened with a soft hiss. She stepped inside without hesitation, but as Jason moved to follow, she paused, turning to look at him one last time. "This is your last chance, Jason," she said softly, her voice tinged with sorrow. "If you come in, there's no going back. You'll be part of this, whether you like it or not." Jason's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. He took a step forward, the door sliding open to reveal the interior of the ship. The space inside was nothing like he expected. It was vast, stretching out in a way that defied logic. The walls were alive with shifting lights, symbols flickering like strange constellations. The air was thick with energy, and the low hum of the ship seemed to vibrate in his bones. He stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a hiss, and for a moment there was silence. Then the woman spoke, her voice distant and resigned. "They've already come. They're waiting." Jason didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. He knew. The creators. The ones who had shaped humanity. The ones who had made this moment inevitable. The ship hummed louder now, and Jason felt his heart race as the floor beneath him shifted. The walls around him began to move, sliding open to reveal a large chamber in the center of the ship. In the middle of the room stood a figure, a towering figure, humanoid in shape but something far beyond anything human. Its eyes were glowing, vast and ancient, and its body shimmered with an otherworldly energy. This was no mere craft. It was a temple, a place of power, a nexus between worlds. The figure was not just a being, it was a creator. One of the ones who had shaped humanity. Jason took a step forward, but the woman's hand shot out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "Don't," she warned, her voice low. "They will judge you." Jason's stomach turned. He didn't know what kind of judgment awaited him. But one thing was certain. He wasn't here by accident. And whatever was about to happen, he would face it as part of this twisted fate, whether he understood it or not. The figure before them moved, its gaze falling on Jason. And in that moment, Jason realized something terrifying. The real trial was only just beginning. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he stood before the towering figure. The air around him seemed thick with an otherworldly energy, pressing down on him from all sides. The ship hummed with a low, vibrating power, almost as if it were alive, breathing with the rhythm of some ancient pulse. The woman, the alien, stood silently beside him, her eyes locked on the figure in front of them, her face pale, distant. There was no comfort in her presence now, no sense of calm that had been there earlier. She was just as caught in this moment as he was. The figure, the creator, moved. Its body shimmered with an ethereal light, the colors swirling like liquid in a vast, unseen ocean. Its eyes were pools of unblinking stars, vast and unfathomable, and as they met Jason's gaze, he felt a shiver race down his spine. He didn't know how, but he knew that the being before him wasn't just looking at him. It was seeing him, every part of him. His thoughts, his fears, his weaknesses, his deepest desires. It was as though this being could peer into his very soul, a feeling that was both terrifying and humbling. "You have made a choice," the figure's voice echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant. It was not a sound Jason could hear with his ears, it was a vibration that seemed to travel directly into his mind. "You have chosen to stand before us, not knowing what awaits you." Jason's breath caught in his throat. It spoke in a way that felt ancient, as though it had been waiting for eons for someone to answer the call. The words were not just directed at him, they were directed at the very core of his being. A choice? What had he really chosen? "You are not the first to stand here, human," the voice continued, its tone carrying an unsettling weight. "Nor will you be the last. You are a part of a greater story, one that spans the fabric of existence itself. You and your kind, born from the hands of those who sought to create and destroy. And now, you stand at the threshold of your reckoning." Jason's knees felt weak. He wanted to speak, to ask questions, to demand answers, but the weight of the being's presence left him speechless. "The threshold of reckoning? You are one of many," the creator continued, its eyes never leaving Jason's. "A tool, a weapon, an instrument in a grand design you do not yet understand. And in your choosing, you have made a mark on the flow of this design." The woman beside him stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "What does it want with him?" she asked, her words trembling. Jason didn't know whether she was speaking to the figure or to herself. The figure turned its gaze to her, and Jason could feel the tension in the air grow even heavier, as if the mere act of acknowledging her had set something into motion. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, before the creator spoke again. "It is not for us to decide what happens now," it intoned, its voice no longer as calm, but filled with an emotion that Jason couldn't place. This one has chosen his path. It is the path of the human species, a path that has already been set in motion. And now we wait. Jason glanced at the woman, confusion clouding his thoughts. Wait for what? What does that mean? He asked, his voice desperate. He needed answers. He needed something, anything, that would make sense of this nightmare. But the woman didn't respond. Instead, she lowered her head, her expression distant. It was as though she had already resigned herself to whatever was about to happen, as though she knew there was no escaping it. The figure before them shifted, its form rippling like water, and suddenly Jason's surroundings seemed to blur and distort. The air warped, bending in unnatural ways. The walls of the ship flickered, and for a split second, Jason could see flashes of distant stars, worlds he couldn't name, civilizations that existed beyond the grasp of human comprehension. We have watched, the creator's voice resonated again, its words vibrating through Jason's body. We have watched your species rise from the ashes, from the dust of your primal ancestors. We have shaped you, guided you, and tested you. And you have always struggled, always fought against the very design we set for you. And now, you are at the edge of your own reckoning. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Struggled? Fought against their design? He had never felt so small, so insignificant in his entire life. The weight of the creator's words made his mind swim with confusion, with the realization that he had been living in a world that wasn't his own. He had been a part of something much larger, a system that had been set in motion long before his birth. You have chosen to defy fate, the figure said, its voice softer now, as though considering its next words carefully. But in doing so you will be tested. Your species, your very existence will be judged. And you, Jason of Earth, will be the test. The air around him seemed to crackle, and a low hum filled the room. The walls glowed brighter, the symbols on the ship shifting rapidly, transforming into patterns that Jason couldn't begin to understand. A strange energy swirled around him, and he felt as if he were being pulled in multiple directions at once, as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. The woman beside him flinched, but Jason barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the figure in front of him, whose eyes seemed to burn with ancient knowledge, its gaze penetrating every part of his being. For a moment, there was nothing but the weight of that gaze, the sense that the entire universe was watching him, waiting for him to make a choice. A choice, Jason whispered to himself, repeating the word that had haunted him since he had first set foot on this ship. What choice had he really made? What choice had he had in any of this? And more importantly, what would happen if he failed? What would happen to humanity if he failed? You are human, the figure said as though reading Jason's thoughts. You are flawed. You are driven by emotion, by a desire to survive, to live. And that is both your strength and your weakness. The creator's eyes glowed brighter now, and Jason felt a surge of energy pulse through the ship, as if the entire structure was reacting to the being's power. It was then that he realized, this was no trial, no test of skill or intellect. It was something deeper. Something more primal. The creator's voice resonated one final time. Your kind will be judged, Jason. Your choice will decide the fate of your species. You will either become a part of a greater whole, or you will burn with the very stars you claim to understand. Jason's mind raced, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He was standing on the precipice of something far greater than he could understand. But one thing was certain, whatever decision he made here, it would shape the future of humanity itself. And as the creator's gaze pierced through him, Jason realized the terrifying truth. There was no running from this. No escaping. The reckoning was here, and it was up to him to decide what happened next. The room around Jason seemed to pulse with an ancient power, every surface vibrating with energy that hummed through his veins. The creator's presence was overwhelming, a living force that pressed in from all sides, its voice reverberating in his chest like the beating of a cosmic heart. It was as if the entire universe was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the one choice that would determine the fate of everything. Jason felt like a pawn on an impossible chessboard, the weight of the universe's judgment hanging over him. His mind was spinning. A test? What could he possibly do to prove himself worthy? And what would happen if he failed? He had no way of knowing, but one thing was certain. This was not something he could run from. This was his moment, the one that would either save humanity or condemn it to oblivion. The figure before him continued to watch, its eyes glowing with that all-knowing, otherworldly light. The air seemed to thicken as it waited, its presence filling the space around them, pushing in on Jason with a force he could barely comprehend. You are human, the creator's voice echoed, deep and resonant. You are flawed, driven by emotions and desires that often cloud your judgment. And yet, you have made a choice. You have chosen to stand before us, to challenge the design that we set for your species. You are not the first and you will not be the last. But you may very well be the one who shapes the course of your kind's future. Jason's throat tightened. His mind raced, trying to process everything that had happened up until this point. The alien woman, her warnings, the ship, the figures watching from the stars, everything had led to this moment. But what was it that made him special? He wasn't some brilliant scientist. He wasn't a hero. He was just human. You speak of choices, Jason said, his voice shaky but growing stronger with every word. But how could I have known what choice I was making? I had no idea what was at stake when I followed her. When I stepped into this ship, I didn't know any of this. I didn't know I was part of some design. The creator's gaze seemed to soften, its vast presence folding around Jason like a blanket. No one ever truly understands the design until they are thrust into it. You are right. You had no way of knowing. But you have chosen now. Not through your actions but through your heart. Your heart has guided you to this moment. Jason's mind reeled. Heart. How was it his heart that mattered? He was just one person standing in a room with a godlike entity, a creature that could end all of humanity with the flick of a wrist. How could his heart matter? But the words echoed in his mind, and for the first time he understood. It wasn't about understanding the universe or defeating some unknown enemy. It was about the essence of humanity, the very thing that made them unpredictable, uncontrollable. It was that chaos, that raw drive to survive and evolve, that had made humanity so dangerous to the creators. The woman beside him remained silent, her eyes never leaving the creator. Her presence, her unspoken understanding, seemed to add weight to the moment. She had once been like him, human before she had been shaped into something else, something more, something tied to this ancient design. And yet, she had not been chosen to make the decision. That burden had fallen to Jason. The creator's voice once again filled the room, pulling Jason from his thoughts. Do you understand now, human? It is your species that we have watched. We have nurtured you, guided you, and even corrected your path when you faltered. But you are a species driven by passion, by curiosity, by the hunger to grow, to break free from the constraints of your creators. You have always been a challenge to us. And now, in this moment, you face a choice that will define your species' future. The creator paused, letting the weight of its words sink into the air. Jason could feel the pressure growing, the moment stretching on as if time itself was holding its breath. The choice. The judgment. What do you mean by judgment? Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mind was struggling to keep up with the magnitude of what was unfolding. What happens if I fail? What happens to us? To humanity? The figure before him did not flinch, its voice calm but filled with the power of ages. Failure has a cost. The judgment of your species will not be easy. If you choose the path that defies our design, you and those of your kind will be cast aside, erased from the fabric of existence. The human species will cease to be, lost to the cosmos, a failure among the stars. But should you choose the other path, if you accept the design, the role we have given you, your species will become something greater. It will ascend, joining us in a new order of existence, one that transcends your current limitations. Jason's mind reeled. Ascend? Erased? The stakes couldn't be higher. The very existence of humanity hung in the balance. He could feel it deep in his bones, the weight of the choice before him pressing down on his chest. I don't want to lose humanity, he said, his voice trembling but firm. But I can't accept being a part of something that controls us, that takes away what makes us who we are. We fight. We don't just follow the design. We make our own. The creator's eyes narrowed, its energy pulsing with intensity. That is the human way. To fight. To reject. To challenge the very structure that holds you. But understand this, Jason of Earth. Your species has reached its breaking point. You have reached the edge of your own extinction. We have given you a chance to ascend, to join a higher order, but if you refuse, if you continue to defy the design, the consequences will be catastrophic. Jason's pulse quickened. The words extinction echoed in his mind, a cold realization that clawed at his thoughts. What would humanity become if they couldn't adapt, couldn't evolve? Would they be lost forever? And then, in that moment of uncertainty, something clicked. The choice wasn't about rejecting their design entirely. It was about how humanity would evolve. How they would survive. Maybe we're meant to evolve, Jason said, his voice steady now, but on our own terms. Maybe we're not supposed to become something perfect, something controlled. Maybe our strength comes from that imperfection. The way we can adapt, change, and, most importantly, fight for our place in the universe. The creator's form seemed to shimmer, its energy pulsing in a way that felt almost like a quiet laugh. You choose to fight then. You choose the human way. Very well. Jason held his breath as the creator's presence intensified, the energy in the room building to a crescendo. It was as if the universe was holding its breath, watching Jason's final decision. The ship's walls began to flicker, symbols flashing across the surfaces like lightning. And for a brief moment, Jason felt a strange warmth, an understanding that went beyond words, beyond logic. It wasn't just about survival, it was about something deeper. Freedom. The creator's voice boomed one final time, its words echoing in every corner of the room, in every cell of Jason's body. Then fight you shall. But know this, human, the consequences of your choice are not yet clear. The judgment has begun. The ship pulsed once more, and then as quickly as it had come, the light began to fade. The tension in the room eased, but Jason could feel it, the weight of what was to come. This was only the beginning. The ship's walls began to dim, their radiant energy slowly flickering out like stars receding into the void. Jason stood in the center of the chamber, his breath shallow, his mind still reeling from the creator's cryptic words. It was over, or at least it felt like it. The choice had been made, the decision set in motion, but the weight of what he had just chosen hung heavy in the air. Beside him, the woman, the alien who had led him here, who had warned him about what he was stepping into, remained silent. She had not spoken since the creator's words had settled. There was a sadness in her eyes, an exhaustion that came from living with the knowledge of a fate that could no longer be avoided. She knew the consequences better than anyone. She had seen them unfold before her, over and over again. "Do you understand now?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her words were not directed at him, but to herself, as though she were speaking to a ghost of her past. Jason turned to her, uncertainty flooding his chest. "Understand what?" he replied, his voice unsteady. She let out a slow breath, her gaze fixed on the fading walls of the ship. "The weight of what you've chosen. I've seen it before. I've witnessed it with my own eyes, watched countless others stand where you are now, and I can't tell you that everything will be all right. That humanity will survive this. That this will end well for you or your people." Jason's heart skipped. "But I have to believe it will. I have to. We can't be controlled forever. We can't just fall into line like you did. We're human. We fight. We'll find a way. That's what we do." The woman turned to him then, her eyes piercing through him. "You misunderstand. It's not the fighting that matters. It's how far you're willing to go to break free of the design. Do you know what that means? Do you understand the cost of defiance?" Jason swallowed hard, his mind flashing back to the creator's final words. "The consequences are not yet clear." The consequences. Extinction. They weren't empty threats. Jason had witnessed the power of the creator, the sheer force that radiated from the being, that could erase entire civilizations without a second thought. But what was the cost of their survival? What did it take to defy the creators and retain humanity's right to choose its own fate? "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a murmur. "But I know that we have to try. We can't just give in, even if we don't know what will happen next. Even if we don't know what the cost will be. I can't let it end like this." The woman looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she sighed and shook her head. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. The design is older than your species, older than the stars themselves. You cannot fight this without consequences, and the consequences are more terrible than you can possibly imagine." Jason took a step toward her, feeling a sudden surge of determination. "Then I'll face them. We'll face them together. We are facing them. The alternative is to let someone else decide for us. And I can't let that happen." Her eyes softened for the briefest of moments, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something like hope in her expression. "You are brave," she said, her voice full of quiet admiration. "But I wonder if you truly know what bravery means. You may win the battle, Jason of Earth, but the war, that is far from certain." Before Jason could respond, the ship's hum shifted, its energy suddenly becoming more erratic. The walls began to flash with rapid pulses of light, each one growing more intense, more violent. The entire chamber seemed to shake, as though the ship itself was reacting to the choice that had just been made. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply as the atmosphere shifted from one of tense uncertainty to one of impending doom. The creator's voice echoed once more, vibrating through every surface of the ship, deep and powerful, shaking the very foundation of their reality. "You have made your choice," it said, its words vibrating with energy. "And now you will see the true weight of that decision. Jason's heart skipped a beat. His body tensed as the energy in the room swirled violently, the flickering lights growing brighter and more erratic with each passing second. The hum of the ship intensified, the sound a low, guttural growl that reverberated through his chest. "You will face the consequences of your defiance," the creator continued, its voice now laced with an undeniable sense of finality. "You will fight, but you will not fight alone. The universe will answer your challenge and you will be tested, not as an individual but as a species. Will your kind rise to meet the challenge, or will you fall? The reckoning has begun." Jason felt the ship lurch beneath him, as if it were shifting into motion, into something far greater than he had ever known. The walls around him began to warp, their shimmering surfaces twisting and distorting like ripples in water. It was as though the ship itself was transforming, becoming something alien and otherworldly. The alien woman beside him flinched, her eyes wide as the reality around them began to warp. "We're not just facing the creators anymore," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. "We're facing everything they've created. The other races. The forces beyond this ship. The ancient powers that you've only heard whispers of. You've unleashed the reckoning, Jason. The entire cosmos will now know you." Jason's chest tightened as the truth began to settle in. It wasn't just the creators who were watching. They were not the only ones who had been pulling the strings. The fabric of reality itself was woven with countless forces, beings, and civilizations that existed beyond the reach of human understanding. He had been warned, but he hadn't understood. Now, as the ship spun out of control, as the ship's core flickered with chaotic energy, he realized just how deeply entangled humanity was in something far greater than they could comprehend. The ship was moving faster now, the stars outside blurring into streaks of light as they shot past, their brightness intensifying. Jason could feel a strange pull, a force that tugged at him from every direction. He gripped the nearest rail, fighting to steady himself as the intensity of the ship's movement reached a fever pitch. "We're going to face them all, aren't we?" Jason said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "The creators, the others, everything." The alien woman's eyes met his one last time, her gaze filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and acceptance. "Yes. You've chosen to challenge the universe itself. And now it will respond." The ship's hum reached a deafening crescendo, and then in the blink of an eye, everything went silent. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, Jason thought they had been thrown into darkness. But the silence was broken by a sudden roar, an explosion of energy that rippled through the ship. The floor beneath his feet trembled, and then just as quickly the light returned, but now it was a cold alien light. Jason stared out the ship's windows, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the impossible. A fleet. A fleet of ships, like nothing he had ever imagined, filled the vast expanse of space ahead of them. It was the reckoning. And it was only just beginning. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.